Good morning. Welcome, everybody. I'm Julian Baggini, and today in this Academy course, today we're going to be looking at 12 life lessons from David Hume, which might strike you as a slightly strange title, actually. David Hume, very famous 18th century philosopher, a real sort of figurehead of the Enlightenment, feted in Paris, well known all over Europe, one of the best known writers of his time. And today, absolutely one of the top-ranked historical philosophers. You may know that there was a survey done not so long ago of a lot of academics in Britain and America asking them a lot of questions about their philosophical positions, but they threw in one question, which is which non-living philosopher do you most identify with? And top of the list, by a comfortable margin actually, was David Hume, beating out such people as Aristotle, Plato, Kant. So he's kind of the philosopher's philosopher. But actually, outside of academia, he's not really that well known. If you used to stop the average person in the street and say, "What do you know about David Hume?" I imagine they would know very little. They may not even know the name. And even people who've studied him at university, perhaps, he's not really known as a practical philosopher. He's most famous for his ideas about the operations of the mind, things about ideas and impressions, which we may or may not mention later. His theories of causation, of course, are also very well known. His writings on religion are well known. It comes to ethics. His ethical writings are well known for his ideas about what the basis of morality is, but not for any sort of practical ethical advice on issues. So he's really not really, as a practical philosopher, life lessons, it would seem very odd to be looking at David Hume. But I think there's actually quite a lot we can learn from Hume. And I think the reason why we miss it is of two things that we kind of neglect. One is that Hume actually wrote a great deal which is not read at all today in academic philosophy departments or taught on courses. Of course, a big chunk of that was histories. In his day, he actually became famous as a historian before he did as a philosopher. His 6-volume history of England was widely praised and, was meant to be the greatest history written to date of England. But also, he wrote a large number of essays on practical issues, political issues, topical issues. And these essays have kind of slipped into the background. They are available. In fact, pretty much everything Hume wrote, apart from his letters and correspondence, is available online at a wonderful website, Hume Texts Online. But they're not really studied. But the other thing is that the way in which we approach philosophy these days is both sort of ahistorical, we might say abiographical. We don't really take much interest in the lives of the philosophers themselves. We look at their ideas, and we take their ideas to be freestanding, things that we can examine on their own merits. And the life and times are almost irrelevant. Now, I think with Hume, if you look at his work and his life together, I think you get a different kind of picture. And of course, we know quite a lot about his life. There've been, Mosner wrote the early definitive kind of biography of him. There's been some other ones since. And there's quite a lot of correspondence that survives from Hume's time as well. So in his letters, we find out quite a lot about what he was thinking and what he was saying. So what I want to kind of convince you of really is that actually Hume is a practical philosopher as well as an interesting theoretical one. And there are very interesting lessons we can learn from him. And I've just selected 12 life lessons. It's a nice round number. Here's the first one. Be stoical with a small s, but don't be a stoic. And I rather like this one because I don't deliberately want to be provocative, but recently there's been a real revival in Stoicism. A lot of books published about it, kind of sometimes referred to as the new Stoicism. A lot of people saying that, in the Stoics, we have a kind of a blueprint for how to live. And many books have been written with that kind of subtext, or not even subtext, as an explicit claim. And a lot of it sounds wonderful. A lot of it sounds very persuasive. Lots of very memorable, pithy quotes you get from the Stoics. telling us things like how we should not become too attached to things that are beyond our control, not worry about things that we can't change, focus on what we can change, and so forth. And a lot of that sounds like very, very good sense. But actually, I think at the end of the day, I'm not persuaded any of us should be Stoics. And I don't think Hume was a Stoic either. Although Hume would agree with a lot of those kind of things you hear repeated as being good Stoic wisdom, but he wasn't a Stoic himself. So what do we know about this? Well, this is interesting again, because as a young man, Hume was very earnest and very keen to get on with things and study and become a man of letters, as he put it. He was born in the early 18th century, born actually in Edinburgh, but he grew up in a place called Churnside near the Scottish borders. 9 Wells was the family estate. His family were not rich by the standards of the middle classes of the time, but of course, by the standards of the 90% of the population, of course they were. They had their own houses in 2 different places, cooks and things like this. And it was a very isolated place, Churnside. He grew up there. He went to university. I think he was been about 12 when he went to university. This was very, very normal at the time. A very strange kind of thing the universities were at the time. He didn't graduate, but again, that was completely normal as well. Because in order to graduate, but when you graduated, the tutor basically got some kind of fee, and only certain tutors were quite able to get that. So a lot of the time, people didn't bother. And he wasn't really that impressed by his university days, actually, and concluded that there's nothing that you can learn from a professor which you couldn't pick up from a book. And that was perhaps something which still remains true today. So maybe you should stop listening now and just read a book instead. But anyway, he did that. He came back, and then he set himself to work very seriously. He was very earnest. He was very, very interested in the Stoics, and he read them very seriously. But he ultimately concluded that the Stoics weren't for him. They weren't right. And why was that? Well, here's a key quote. I think Hume puts things so well. If you read Hume, initially, it can sometimes be a bit off-putting. His 18th century prose has a lot of kind of long sentences, slightly strange spellings, etc., etc. But if you can sort of get into the rhythm of it, he's actually a wonderful writer, great stylist, and very, very clear. And here's his kind of the bottom line about why you shouldn't be a Stoic with a capital S. Philosophers have endeavored to render happiness entirely independent of everything external. That degree of perfection is impossible to be attained. Now, that really is the hard message of Stoicism, which I think a lot of modern advocates kind of gloss over. If there's anybody in the room who's a modern Stoic, as it were, you can feel free to argue with me later. I know that there are people who say this is simply not true. The Stoics did think that things like our relationships could be of value, even money, pleasure, all the things that we normally take pleasure in. The Stoics did think they could be of value, but they weren't of the highest value, and we had to be careful about how we related to them. It's how we related to them that mattered. But actually, I think if you look at what the Stoics actually said, I think that's making it sound a bit more palatable than it really is. On their theory of value, the only thing that really mattered was our intellect. It was logos and reason, and that was the only thing within our control. And everything else was relegated. And they called them preferred indifference, in the sense that it was okay to take a certain amount of pleasure of them if they came along or were part of your life, but you mustn't get attached to them, and you mustn't see them as being great importance. And that's why you've got these fairly sort of hard passages which are there in black and white, such as I always forget which Stoic said what, but that when you kiss your wife and you kiss your children, you should remind yourself that they're just flesh and blood and they will die, so that you are not too upset when they do die. So it's this kind of thing of making yourself invulnerable to things that are not in your control as being the key to happiness. And as Hume said here, therefore rendering happiness entirely independent of everything external. Now, you can see why you would want to make your happiness independent of everything external. Wouldn't that be wonderful? That would mean your happiness, you would be invulnerable, essentially. Nothing that happened to you could affect your happiness. Your happiness would only be affected by what was internal to you, your own ways of thinking, and so forth. So it's a very, very attractive option. But Hume says here that degree of perfection is impossible to be attained, because that's just not a human life, frankly. And if you look at how the Stoics actually lived, you find that they really didn't live up to what they're advocating here anyway, most of the time. They did value things external to them. A few of them had quite a bit of money for a start. Now, here's another quote which I think takes this a little bit further, makes it a little bit clearer. The real idea of becoming a Stoic with a capital S is essentially to sort of extinguish or to dampen down those emotions and passions which make us attached to things that are beyond our control, right? Now, here's what Hume says. Those refined reflections which philosophy suggests to us is that commonly they cannot diminish or extinguish our vicious passions without diminishing or extinguishing such as are virtuous and rendering the mind totally indifferent and inactive. So what Hume's really suggesting here is that it's kind of not possible to like selectively switch off the emotions which lead us to unhappiness and distress, etc., without at the same time switching off all those other emotions which give us the joys in life. So if you go back to relationships, you can't turn off the emotions which are going to make you distraught and heartbroken if those close to you die, without also switching off precisely those emotions which make it such a delight to be with them when they're alive. So in that first quote, he says that that degree of perfection is impossible to be attained. I think really the conclusion he's also got is that it's not desirable to attain it. You wouldn't want to become the kind of person that the Stoics claim we should be.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.